Okay, so you see on the screen the people who I will now encourage to come up to this table for debate for the first session. I'm Stephanie Flanders. I run economics and government at Bloomberg. We're delighted to be here. I'm looking forward to, as we've already heard, I think the lessons for the students are the same for all of us. We must listen, we must challenge and connect. I would like the speakers to particularly challenge each other so that we can begin with the right kind of inquiring spirit. But I think I'd be delighted to have everyone join me up here. I know that the President I will start by asking the President a question, but he's not going to give a speech, we've already been told. But Charles Michel, the President of the European Council, and Sri Mulyani Indrawati, the Minister of Finance for Indonesia. Annabelle Long, who is the founder and managing partner at Bertelsmann Asia Investments. And Anish Shah, who's the managing director and CEO of the Indian multinational Mahindra Group. Mensah, CEO of Merrill Lynch International and President of International for Bank of America. And Markus Krebber, CEO of the German multinational energy company RWE. Okay, I hope that will be, and I apologize, I have a cold, although my colleague Francine Lacroix is even more sick, which is why I'm here and not her. I hope that was the most formal thing that we do in the next hour or so. We will have a conversation about the challenges of bringing together private and public capital in pursuit of this vital, urgent, but terribly complicated challenge that we face in confronting climate change. Mr. President, we know the private sector is absolutely essential. You don't have to be an economist to do the arithmetic and understand how much private capital will be needed for this challenge. But we are also learning, I think, almost every week, the importance of the public sector setting goals, deadlines, legal frameworks, getting it wrong, getting it right, depending on which country you look at. From where you are, what are the biggest priorities?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. And first, a promise, I will not make a speech. And don't hesitate to interrupt me if you have the impression that I'm breaking the promise. No, this is really great to be with you. This is the first edition, and we never forget the first time. That's why this is a very exciting moment. No, more seriously, I feel that we all share the same assessment. We all understand that climate change and digital transformation are both fundamental challenges for our common future. And on the EU side, this is the growth strategy. This is the socio-economic program of the European Union, point one. Point two, I remember very well 4 years ago when we took the decision, the 27 head of state, head of governments within the European Union to make Europe neutral by 2050. It was a very clear goal, and it is our responsibility to set strategic objectives, common goals. I remember also at that time some observers were skeptical, but since then we can see that we are followed by many countries across the world. Maybe not exactly with the same level of ambition, maybe not exactly with the same speed, not exactly with the same measures, but it is very clear that this 21st century industrial revolution will be green and digital. Point two, you're absolutely right, we need massive investment in a short period of time. And that's why we need to find the right balance between the need for the public sector to invest and to trigger private investments. And of course, what I will say is not exceptional, it is obvious, but sometimes it's needed to repeat things that should be obvious. First, we need stability, legal stability, regulation, legal certainty, and this is the role of the policymakers. The European Union has a role to play, I think, at the global level. And point two, and this is my main point, based on the experience the recent months, G20, United Nations, 1 week ago, I feel there is a growing debate, and there is an urgent need for what I would call a new Bretton Woods moment. We need a new global financing pact. This is very clear. And in our part of the world, within the European Union, I think it's very important for us not to have a narrow vision. We have our own perspective, and this is normal. The G7, we have the full control on the Bretton Woods institution. This is the reality, this is the truth. Why? Because when those institutions were launched 60 years ago, the world was absolutely different. Many countries didn't exist because they were not independent. There is a new reality today, and for us it's important to be lucid, to understand what's going on in other parts of the world. And here I think the EU has a special role to play. And that's why indeed those reforms will be needed, are urgent. This is a growing debate. There was an event in Paris a few months ago. There is this Bridgestone initiative with Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, and this was one of the main topics within the United Nations a few days ago in New York. And I see two priorities. I will end my speech. I see two priorities. First one, let's make sure that this is possible for the IMF and the World Bank to maximize the capacities, taking into account the current capitalization. And second point, it will be needed sooner or later to consider an increase of capital. Just one example. The World Bank, if you take the World Bank, in comparison with 60 years ago, the capitalizations compared to the global GDP is 7 times lower. It means something. If we want to address the challenges, especially in difficult times, in difficult circumstances, they need capacities. And point two, the decision-making process. We need more inclusivity, and that's why it was mentioned, and thank you for that. I think this is very good that we made a first step, a small step, but a step which is needed by accepting the African Union within the G20. This is not enough, and I think that there's a broader debate related to the multilateral model with the UN at the core of the multilateral system, and the need for a reform to make sure that there is more inclusivity. If not, some others will be attempted to develop a parallel multilateral model, but not necessarily with the same goals, with the same values, with the same principles. I stop here, and thank you for your attention.
Well, you have reminded us of many things we will want to talk about, but Minister Indrawati, I'm particularly glad that you're here because Indonesia is right at the heart of the climate challenge in Southeast Asia. We know it's responsible for, I think, 40% of the emissions in Southeast Asia. And you've also been, when we talk about the ambition and the hope of public-private partnership, you're among the first countries to be involved in a very ambitious effort to mobilize the private sector in decarbonizing electricity generation. So what are you learning from that experience so far about this broader challenge that we're talking about, and how do you see it?
I think the most important is how we design the transition. Most of the policymakers, and especially we are talking here among the students, the younger generation recognize that climate change is going to destroy a lot of things, and we have to really change. But the question is how you are going to design the transition, and that's why in Indonesia we are also talking about how we design transition. If you look at decarbonizing the economy, the two biggest contributors is the energy and transportation. I mean, for Indonesia, we've already have the national determined contribution in which we are going to reduce by 1.2 billion ton of CO2, and 45% is actually coming from the energy. But also the cost is actually around 85% or 90% of 280 billion that is really needed. Certainly cannot be provided by the public sector, which we only provide around 15%. So the question is coming from where? President Michel mentioned about the World Bank and the MDBs in this case. They are going to max out their balance sheet, but as much as they can try to maneuver and using their existing equity, I think there is always a limit, and that's why at some point there is a need of capital, but then the question, what kind of order that you are going to establish in this new Bretton Woods? sharing, voting power is going to be very important within the context of the whole new global south, you call it earlier. So this is going to be quite a lot. It's not only financing, but then governance, composition, which is going to be very important. Back to the Indonesia, we try to, and we recognize that private sector is the most important one. You talk about transition, these are all going to be the most important. How you are going to invite the private sector? We developed the energy transition mechanism, platform, country platform. We provide this platform as an example of communication, what kind of policy and regulation that we are established so that there is a clarity. During the G20 Indonesia presidency last year, we launched the Just Energy Transition mechanism, and also then there is a 20 billion commitment, mostly private sector. When we discuss with all this private sector, they are talking about what is the regulatory framework. That's including on the capital market. That's why 2 days ago, President Jokowi launching the first carbon market security within Indonesia. We try, we always try. We don't hesitate that this is not perfect yet, but we will try, and then we get the feedback. So we mobilize through the capital market. We know that the private sector is very sensitive on the risk. And now with the higher for longer interest rate, it's going to be even more difficult to mobilize private sector. They are becoming very skittish, they are becoming very critical, capital becoming very expensive. So what kind of risk profile which is acceptable from the private sector but affordable? You talk about just transition later on in this session. What you call a just is actually measured by what? Is it affordable by the people, by the industry, by the country? Because at the end of the day, a lot of subsidy as well as government guarantee needed, or even investment. So these are all need to be put it within one platform so that it's become transparent. Luckily for Indonesia, our budget is relatively healthy despite after the pandemic. I think many of emerging and developing markets is not in the same like Indonesian situation. They have a very high debt. Indonesia is only 38% of GDP public debt. Most of the emerging developing countries, they are much higher, and they cannot afford to subsidize or to intervene to even provide guarantee. So we use our healthy budget in order for us to be able to create the right condition for all the private sector. On the regulatory, we also discuss with many of the private sector, they say that if Indonesia want to retire coal, because 80% now, 60% of our energy is actually based on coal. We have a lot of coal. We have all the incentive to keep the coal, of course. But we actually launching the retirement of the coal energy power plant. And we actually using this as an example how this transition is going to be financed. And that will require quite a lot of the discussion about taxonomy. That is at the capital market. They want to join financing without being punished that you are going to finance this kind of coal retirement plan. The taxonomy in ASEAN has been launched because Indonesia today, as a chairman of the ASEAN, we launched the ASEAN taxonomy version 2, providing the coal retiring as the financing which is recognized by the capital market, not being punished that you are financing the coal power plant, but you are financing the retirement of the coal power plant. But this is only applied to the ASEAN. It should be interoperable globally. Europeans have their own taxonomy, and that's why this kind of the discussion about networking and globalized rule making and principle, I think is going to be very important. The third one is actually we are trying to discuss about what kind of private sector, which is not only just borrowing, because we usually like in the World Bank and so on, we borrow from the bank. And for country with a high debt already, they cannot borrow because their fiscal space is already empty, it's gone. So they need more equity, but equity is much more risky and it's much more longer. So this kind of regulatory framework is going to be very, very important for the country to be able. So that's why in Indonesia, we use this energy transition mechanism country platform in order for us to provide the whole full menu for all participants, whether this is multilateral development bank, public sector, private sector, and philanthropists. And we blend it into this blended finance and then put it in one example like retiring this 1 gigawatt coal power plant. They are going to operate until 2040. How about if we will finish in 2030, 10 years earlier? How much it costs? The financer, the IPP, they've already investing and they expect to have revenue until 2040. Now you cut it 10 years. What does it mean? They are not going to be, oh, okay, because climate change is good, I'm going to just forego my 10 years revenue. It's not going to work that way. So we really have to calculate what is the net present value of the revenue stream, who will compensate, who will pay, and then what kind of risk. This kind of situations is the real, what you call it, transition challenge within Indonesia. If you can solve the Indonesia problem, I think you can solve the world, Stephanie, in this case. So that's, I'm going to stop here.
But I want to come back to you though, because I do think, and you have confirmed to me that you are the right person to have on this panel, because at events like this, and particularly at Glasgow, for example, at the COPs, we have these grand announcements, much excitement around the just energy transition partnerships, and what you're saying is there's an awfully long way from that excitement to the details of what it means in a country
well,
like
because we are in campus, we are not going to just talking about the headline news. The headline news is JETP 20 billion. We are talking here in the campus is how does it work? Is it really coming from the headline into the transaction? And if this transaction is tested, then you actually can replicate and scale up.
And you don't have that yet, right? 10 months on.
We've already discussed, well, we are actually almost close. That's why in the next UNFCCC COP28 in UAE, I push very hard to make sure that this test case of retiring coal earlier will work.
Is that a promise?
It's already on the pipeline. We are preparing, and we are going to announce it. Okay. If it is failed, something beyond me. For sure. That's disclosure in this case.
Annabelle, I'm going to come to you because we heard the mention of the private sector capital and the complexity of the vehicles that are being created to try and help a country like Indonesia confront this. You're obviously very active in Asia. What are you seeing on the ground when it comes to investors engaging with these new vehicles that we're all very excited about?
Sure. Firstly, very humbled and honored to be on this panel trying to provide my personal observation on micro perspective, because I'm interacting with entrepreneurs, especially early stage entrepreneurs, on a daily basis. So to me, I think three key will be the solutions to this paradigm shift will be innovation, especially pushing the next generation technology and business model, really prepare us mentally, also physically. Entrepreneurship will be one of the answers, being most effective. Thinking about Teslas and NIOs, electronic vehicles, solar panels, many of these highly risky investments was actually backed by venture capital in the beginning, push until later stage. Still, many of the electronic vehicle companies are still loss-making, but we see the impact, the change they already create for the economy, for the workforce, for the consumer demand side. And secondly, I think collaboration is essential. It takes diversified supply chain, takes from east to west, from north to south, takes understanding regarding different stage of development at different countries, really to find models that really works for them. And lastly, I think there is really inclusion. The world is actually not flat. Instead, the road to globalization is quite bumpy. It really takes, understand for companies with global vision to have a global approach, their impact going to make on local environmental and social environment. How do they make sure they're complying to a different level, really try to understand the transition of a technology or business model between the traditional and the new emerging. So those will be my very brief answers to the current challenges. But I really feel hopeful the potential impact yet to be understood and challenged. For instance, AI, we're very much hoping next generation technology can greatly be deployed through AI-driven energy efficiency platform. Before that, they need to understand what's the consumption of energy, the potential computing power AI is going to consume, and how do we balance that? But in general, we see the awareness for all the investors to be more responsible. In China only, for example, already 1,000 funds managing around $17 billion ESG-related green tech emphasized. The number in Southeast Asia actually grow by my AUM 5 times in the last 5 years. So there's a hope.
And when the governments are trying to announce new vehicles or ways to reduce the obstacles to venture capital and to private entrepreneurs coming into these clean energy projects, do you think, I mean, have you seen successes? Have you seen ways that money has been galvanized, or not quite so much yet?
It's quite effective. Think about the subsidized and also the encouraging policy on taxation, talents, everything. But I still have to say private investment has to be profit-driven. Entrepreneurship is the answer to that. You really need to build something upon a very, very strong business fundamentals based on consumer awareness and authenticity. That's the key. Think about the scooters, the shared economy on the street of Berlin. Involves no breaking through technology, but it is really re-innovation, reinvention of a business model, also promotion of a useful, playful urban culture.
All right, so we just have to look to the scooters.
Try one.
Anish, I think you've been one of those who's highlighted the challenge as well as the aspiration in a country like India. You're trying to kind of do not just talk about having a greener supply chain and production, but you also recognize the enormous gap between rhetoric and reality.
Yes, there clearly is an enormous gap. And it starts with commitment. And commitment is not about conversations that talk about getting to net zero by 2040 or 2050 or 2060. It's about what are we doing today? Are we on track to be able to get there? What are the tangible actions from an energy efficiency standpoint, a waste to landfill, a water standpoint? And are we measuring it? And these are things that we've got to be able to get to. How are we changing technology, or how are we bringing technology into new industries? So I think that commitment part is very important, but that has to be very tangible. The second aspect to that is, how do public and private firms work together? And one classic example we've seen in India is the commitment that the government made was that we will get to 50% renewable energy by 2030. That's a very bold target. And a lot of subsidies were put in place for solar to get kick-started. And today, it is actually viable economically. So there's no further subsidy that's required. We have a solar business as one of our businesses. And we've got an ambitious plan to grow 5x in the next 5 years. And that will require more than $5 billion of capital. And we could actually mobilize that very quickly. There were multiple global investors who wanted to come in. And we've set up an InvIT structure, and that's moving forward. And therefore, that transition will take place fairly seamlessly. We've put in captive power plants for each of our facilities, and we are paying 30 to 40% less than what we would with fossil fuel. So there's a pure economic incentive to move there. There is no one that's telling us that you need to move there. There's no one that's saying that if we don't have capital, we're not going to do it. So I think that's really the model. How do we get public finance to prove something? And once it's proven, how do we get private capital to scale it up? And the last part I'd say is the collaboration. And this is something where I would highlight the World Economic Forum in setting up the First Movers Coalition and a number of other facilities where companies can work together. And we're working with global companies. We're working with Johnson Control to set up net zero buildings in India across the industry. So how can companies collaborate, use the technologies they have to be able to decarbonize industries? And that collaboration will really help us take a big step forward.
And Markus Krebber, I know that your company is hugely active, obviously, in the renewable energy space, but has also spoken quite a lot about the need for the public sector to be consistent, to be shaping the demand side of the equation here and setting deadlines and other things. What are the lessons for you of the public and private collaboration in trying to accelerate this road to net zero?
I would like to come back what the President said. It's about, for private capital, it's always about a reliable long-term framework. Because the investments we do in the energy transition are a bit different than in the fossil world. It's all front-loaded capex. So you bring a lot of capital, you don't have a lot of operating costs, and that means interest rates matter a lot, but also you need stability for 20, 25 years. And here's a conundrum we are currently in. The global energy system is massively underinvested. Yeah? Also on the LNG side, but especially on the renewable side. We have not enough energy available. But when I look at our private capital providers, and we have a 50 billion capital investment program until the end of the decade, and I go back 3 years, the question was always, can you spend more? Can you go faster? Can you do more? Currently, the sentiment is, are we sure that we can get the right returns for that? And the question is, why is that? That is because supply chains are sometimes broken, not only because of COVID, but also about geopolitical tensions. We have a higher inflation environment, we have higher interest rates, and there are big question marks about, are we doing the right things in the right order? Because in the one, I totally agree that affordability is important. And in the end, the cost of the transition will be determined by two aspects, two vectors. One is, how many different technologies do we have available, and are they allowed? And when I look at European regulation, how complicated we make things like hydrogen, you actually rule it out. In certain countries, CCS technology is not allowed. By limiting the technologies, we make it more expensive. And the other vector is how fast we go. The faster we go, the more expensive it will be. But we know that in the end, the affordability is relevant, and maybe people, even in OECD countries, are willing to pay 5 to 10% premium for green, but not 40. What does it mean? I think we need to be much more rational, and I see it in many parts of the world. We need to come up with a clear merit order of CO2 savings. So where are the lowest abatement costs? And there we should put the money. And we should not try to do everything at the same time. And we are currently driving some measures in the Western world where the abatement costs are above 300 euros. Someday they will come, but in order to tackle the global problem, we really need to spend the money where we get the biggest CO2 savings first.
Where is that?
I mean, currently it's definitely the power sector. I think everywhere where we can do solar, it makes a lot of sense. But should we really push for sustainable aviation fuels now? The abatement costs are implicitly 300 euros a ton.
Bernie Mensah, it's unusual to come to the banking sector last. Sorry, I'm going to try and get my voice back. I'm speechless at the challenges. You know, when it often comes down to the banks, because there's a sort of feeling that as if the banks just made sure that they were backing the right things and not backing the wrong things, all our problems would be solved. But you're facing very conflicting challenges in the US particularly. You have a backlash against some of the ESG considerations, but also excuse me, a big focus on shareholders of your commitments. So how do you see the role of finance, the financial community?
No, thanks, Stephanie. Thanks for having me. Shall I
No, no,
I was about to open it for you. Thanks for, absolutely. We're not, we're financiers, but I remind people of our basic function, which is to marry excess savings with those that need it. So whether it's us or the World Bank or governments, in some instance, we're supposed to gather huge excess savings. And for us in finance, what we do is we price and allocate that, and we use the capital markets to do that as well. Now, I think there are huge excess savings in the world, in Northern Europe, in parts of East Asia, and the challenge that we all have is getting those savings to the right projects at the right price. But also, when we do move those savings, there's different risk appetite within those savings, and the minister made the point, equity capital, scale-up capital, new technologies coming in, and large-scale debt capital at a price, because the cost of that financing is important. And so, unfortunately, we are in a 5% versus a 0% world. Now, when we were in the 0% world, a lot of financing did go in. And the piece where, if I can have a little bit of positivity or so some good news, is the amount of investments that has gone in this space in the last 5 years is a huge quantum versus the previous 5 years. So if you take 2020 to 2015, 2015 to 2020, 2020 to 25, now it's still small in the scale of what we need to do, but it's huge before. And so the challenge now at 5% is that that doesn't slow down. So if you take Bank of America, we and other large global institutions committed in 2021 to a $1.5 trillion allocation or direction of capital into renewable space. We're up at 400-500 billion of that 1.5 trillion already. And if you look at the commitment that we started to make these commitments in the 2005, 6, 7 level. And I think us and other financial institutions have seen hundreds of billions of dollars. So the amount that has gone into putting new capacity into place is huge. It's just starting to scratch at the surface. But I think all of that is going to come online, and Markus will know better than me, at some point in the next period of time. But there is a challenge, because when capital is that bit more expensive, then people are saying, what is the return on capital? The US does have a really dynamic discussion about decarbonization and not. But within that, we have to give the US credit. A huge amount of renewable power has come online. Within the classic US creative destruction environment, there's a lot of entrepreneurialism, there's a lot of risk that is taking, and the US is quite efficient about getting the right risk capital in the right part of the cap structure to make things happen. And the US has put in its new Inflation Reduction Act, et cetera, which is coming in and driving some investments in this space. And by the way, the EU is doing that as well. And I say to my EU colleagues when I see them, there's a huge amount of capacity and savings in the EU. It's really a question of how aggressively do you drive that, and how simple do you make the tax environment in place to allow companies to take advantage of that. And then the final thing I would say is there are a lot of nitty-gritty things that need to happen in the finance space. Taxonomy, especially some of the accounting standards, they may be boring, but it crowds in the capital that's needed. So I'm optimistic about the huge amount of excess savings that are out there, in sometimes representing a demographic challenge, particularly in Europe, for example. But I do recognize that in the next period of time, it's going to be tougher, and we're going to need to be that bit more creative to get the capital to the right place.
Mr. President, Bernie's mentioned about the IRA and the EU also doing subsidies. I think there is a bit of a debate about whether this competition of subsidies is productive or harmful for the overall objective.
No, this is a very important point. In my opinion, there are two fundamental tools to address the climate change issue. The first one is the carbon pricing. It is the choice made by the European Union. And you can observe that more and more countries are following a similar approach. Even China, this is not exactly the same model, is very clear, but even China is putting in place some elements very close to this principle of carbon pricing. The IRA is something totally different, because this is based on the subsidies, very targeted subsidies. And that's why we need this honest conversation for a certain level playing field. I'm not naive. We need a certain convergence. We will never find the ways for exactly the same decisions, the same approaches. But it's very important, in my opinion, to promote an approach based on the carbon pricing. And then the second point is green financing. I know that the EU is the first emitters of green bonds, which is an important tool to leverage money for that purpose. My second point is related to what you said, the supply chains. And you are absolutely right that the geopolitical stability is extremely important. And that's why I'm making the link with what I said just before. We need a multipolar world, and Olaf Scholz is absolutely right. This is a risky situation that we are facing today, because there are some temptations to build again a bipolar world with everyone which would be forced to choose one camp against the other camp. And here I am absolutely convinced that we, on the EU side, we have a special responsibility for many reasons to fight politically at the international level for a multipolar world. And it means an honest conversations between the so-called Western part of the world with the so-called Global South, which need to take into account all the different elements. This is what you said. And this example, and I like this example of the Just Energy Transition Partnership, is extremely interesting, because this is a very useful concept. The idea is great. We have started to put it in place with several countries, and under your your G20 presidency, we made additional steps, we made progress, but there is a difference between the principle, the very generous idea, and then the implementation. And we have the responsibility to assess, to evaluate. If we make promises, it's very important to assess 6 months later, 1 year later, what did we do? Is it implemented? And if not, why it is not implemented? What do we need to adjust? What do we need to adapt? This is how I see the role of the European Union. Well, these are a few points in reaction, and I sincerely think that the European Union, we have a special role to play because we can be a bridge between several parts of the world. And this is for that reason that 1 week ago in the United Nations, I have advocated for more cooperation between the regional organizations, ASEAN, Latin America, CELAC, European Union, African Union. I think that this is a possible pillar for the strengthening of the multilateral system.
But Minister, when you hear, with the countries with a great deal of a role in the existing system, in the Bretton Woods system, want to galvanize it and make sure that it's still still a dominant player. But for others, perhaps it's good to have others wanting to present different models, particularly in Asia. So how do you see that competition of models? Can it be a positive thing?
Well, actually, I just arrived from the AIIB 8th annual meeting 2 days ago in Sharm el-Sheikh. The word about the multipolarity in this case, but how we are going to be able to continue working, because we are talking about climate change. It's not like the climate change in the north, climate change in the south. So we are talking about the global climate change. So when we are talking about solution, it's supposed to be global, but then the world order is fragmented. I think for many of the countries, including Indonesia, you mentioned, President Michel, that we are not supposed to make a choice between West or East or whatever the block that you are going to name it. But we will make sure, for a country, our homework is try to make the policy and regulation right. And that's why when we are hosting the G20, ASEAN, we are developing taxonomy, we introduce carbon market. Although the price is still very low, $4.5. Of course, in Europe, it's going to be totally very high. But this is something that needs to be built. So each country have to do their homework. There is a capacity building, there is a technical challenge, but this needs to be addressed. And this is the area of cooperation, how you are going to make sure the cooperation of capacity building can be done. The second one, after you make the regulatory and policy right, is actually you are going to make sure that the risk, especially private sector, is going to be fit with this kind of platform. And that is exactly what we need to test within the transaction. You are talking about many of the blended finance to fill the gap of this now 0% to 5% interest rate environment, which we are going to have a huge implication on affordability. Who's going to then pay for this affordability and whether this is sustainable or not? That is going to be the real question. I actually hear many of you talking about the renewable. I think renewable is much more easier to attract capital, because they are all going to the renewable. You talk about solar, hydro, you talk about wind, but the most difficult is the existing fossil fuel power. And when you talk about the transition, you are not going to shut down this fossil fuel and then immediately tomorrow you are going to have a renewable. First, you are going to hit with the energy security. In each of your country, you still rely on this fossil fuel as a base load. So the discussion in this case is how you are going to combine between this base load and this new. I'm not expert in the technology, but my observation on all this meticulous detail on the preparation of transaction, renewable is the most attractive one, although with the higher interest rate, is still attractive one. But dealing with designing energy security for each country so that you are not suddenly that you are vulnerable to the supply chain, geopolitical. That's going to be, because you are not going to save the world when you politically is not safe also. So that is going to be something that create quite a lot of policy constraint as well as option at the same time.
Anish, you did highlight the success of making renewables affordable, but of course for the rest of the world there's also a big question about whether or not India's coal stays in the ground or not. Do we have the right tools for supporting Indian business and Indian government in doing that? And should it just be a question of India?
I would actually share a ray of optimism here because, as I said earlier, a target of 50% renewable in the next 7 years is a phenomenal target. So we are really looking at renewable plants coming up all over India. We're not really seeing any more fossil fuel plants coming up. So yes, there may be some, as the minister mentioned, to plan for the energy transition, but everything is about renewable. We are in 20 industries, and 2 of our main industries are automobile and tractors. And these are hard to abate sustainability problems in a sense. And for these businesses, we've got a 95% energy efficiency already achieved since our baseline. We've got 80% of our energy use being renewable by the end of next year. So these are significant jumps that we are taking, and therefore I would look at really an optimism for approach in terms of where the government is, where it's taking this industry, as well as where the private sector is.
But the new fossil fuel generator, but what about the old ones? Is there enough of a structure to be taking those offline?
I think that will happen as well, because as we start putting in new energy, also recognize the fact that we are transitioning to electric vehicles. So the need for energy is going to go up significantly as well. But as this transition takes place, I think there will have to be a plan to take down the old fossil fuel plants as we bring in renewable energy. But 7 years is a very aggressive time frame. And then once we get that, I'm certain there's going to be more aggressive time frame moving forward beyond that as well.
If I may share some of the optimism here. This year, the automobile sales in China is nearly flat. However, electronic vehicle sales jumped by 40%. The penetration rate is already at 30%. China is producing nearly 80% of the solar panel for the world, but in the same time, installing nearly 40% of that inside the country. So you see a structural change shifting happening already.
But the generation of the electricity matters as well as whether or not it's electric cars or...
But that's just the beginning of the change.
But I think with China, the problem is people look at what's coming on stream every year and think about how long these generators last. We focus on the electric vehicles and not always so much on the generation.
But lithium batteries and other technologies are also coming into play, so you also see a further penetration into foundational energy-related technology. Certainly, I'm not an expert technically to speak of this, but you see the structural changes actually happening.
I mean, Markus, you mentioned that part of the problem is you're now looking at the long term, not having enough energy to meet, say, European energy needs. Does that provide incentives for governments to choose the wrong path when it comes to clean energy versus dirty energy? The words energy security then become an excuse for doing pretty much anything.
No, I don't see the risk that we do the wrong things, because the massive
Not even in the UK?
Mm-hmm. No. Because, I mean, if you look at where the investment's going, nobody is currently investing again in the Western world in fossil energy supply. So the massive investment in the green technology will solve the energy and climate problem at the same time. I would like to come back to one point, because I think the discussion whether we have conflicts and competition between the IIA and the European Union or other frameworks we see in Asia is a distraction, because for me that is not the real point. If you look at the massive investment we need, I think every region needs to get its house in order and investments in place anyhow, because we need quadrupling capacity of turbines. I mean, 10 times more solar panels, 1,000 more electrolyzers. So the ramp up will happen anyhow. It's not the question whether it goes here or there. Every region needs to get their act together. So the competition in the end is for resources. Where is the framework the best? And the best here is the most de-risked one, because you need to de-risk it, otherwise you need to pay investors a very high return, and that means very high cost of energy for consumers and industries. And I think I see it a bit as a distraction. What the European Union could learn from the United States is they have a more implicit, a comprehensive approach, because they think the supply chain with their incentives in a comprehensive way, because supply chain de-risking is very important. I really think about when I build an offshore wind farm, where do I order the turbines? I don't want to order them from a region where because we have lead times of 5 years, where I can see tariffs or even sanctions, and getting part of that de-risk and building that in the regions where you put your money is definitely worth a lot. And maybe one last point, if you allow me. I think the European and the US way both can work. I mean, the European to incentivize green investments, it's more a philosophical question. The US does incentives for green technologies. With that, you make a competitive advantage for green investments compared to fossil ones. And you bring down energy prices because the mix is still green and fossil, and by subsidizing green, you bring down. European way is the other way. You tax carbon. By that, you make carbon more expensive. Relatively, renewables are competitive, but you drive up energy prices because there is still fossil in the mix. But you also collect a lot of money from selling the carbon permits. And then you go and take that money which you have collected and get it back into the industries to keep them competitive compared to the US. I would say philosophically both can work, but you have different approaches. Typical US low government, European big government approach.
Yes, Mr. President.
If I may challenge.
Big government.
If I may
Can
challenge
I ask big government?
No. First, I think that indeed it is very important that the American government took the decision to trust the Paris Agreement and to follow our common ambition to tackle this common global climate change. This is the good point. This is the good part of the story. And you're absolutely right that there is a lot of investment that are needed. And this is very good when many countries across the world are determined to address the climate change. But there is a difference. And the difference is the following. Is the fact that on the EU side, we made a choice, which is a carbon pricing. In the United States, they are making another choice, which is the subsidies. It means a creation of level playing field. And it's, in my opinion, not a distraction. This is very serious, because what we should try to do together, if we would like to develop a multipolar world, this is working together to create a common environment with similar principles, with similar approaches. And this is making a difference, because it means that for our European companies, for our European businesses, if the message is for you, you will have to follow this carbon pricing, which works well, by the way, because for many years we have put it in place with a certain success. But in the United States, it's a totally different approach. You will get state aid. This is not the same thing. And that's why, in my opinion, this is not a distraction. Another point, I think that you're absolutely right, that you need to make priorities. Not possible to address everything at the same time. But here, again, I think this is not easy. This is a democratic political debate. But on the EU side, we made two very clear choices, and we are followed by the G20, for instance. First, this is the renewable. Let's triple our common goals in renewable. And second, energy efficiency. Let's double our common goals in that field. And we can see that only in a few months after having taken the decision in the multilateral system, G20, some other coalitions, there is more and more support for this approach. And this is in line, I think, with what you said. We need priorities. This is what we are trying to do. It doesn't mean that the debates are easy. Sometimes we have difficult discussions among the member states because of the technologies. You're absolutely right. But at the end, we will need to find the right energy mix, which guarantees the energy security, the energy sovereignty. And for that, we need more cooperation among the countries. This is true at the European level. This is true at the global level.
So this is a business school, so we have to allow people to ask questions. And I may have misunderstood, but I think there are particular places that you should go, or there's someone with a microphone here. If you want to go and wait in line to ask a question over here, consider your questions for this eminent panel. We have about 10 or 15 minutes left. But Bernie, I wanted to just come back to what the minister said about the incentives that everybody wants to be in renewables, but some of the thorniest questions for Indonesia and for many countries, particularly in the global south, is the transition of the fossil part of the chain. And actually some of the commitments and frameworks that financial institutions have been part of, like FGANs, and the very detailed commitments that you're making as part of that, the criticism has been that the incentive is just to offload the high-polluting assets rather than actually reduce emissions in the real world. You know, you're putting them on someone else's balance sheet, but you're not. So, I mean, how do we make sure we have the right incentives?
Well, there's the issue of the stranded assets. I would say that there are market mechanisms that can come into play, because a lot of the dialogue is really a question of what is the transition timetable. Is it too fast? Is it too slow? Sometimes we wait for the governments to set it. It's difficult if it hits sort of the consumer and the retail. The minister makes a good point that politicians will have, you know, a certain, quite rightly, contract with the population in terms of how they manage that. But at the same time, the speed at which we declare ourselves to be fossil-free, or our ability to continue to invest in fossil fuels in some transition period as a base load matters. Now, I think that there are market mechanisms that can come into place, and there's been talks around where there's, you know, some of the G-Funds type efforts of voluntary carbon credits, etc., that can come into place. And when I look at that dialogue, I sort of think, and I don't want to declare one way or another, but you let the perfect be the enemy of the good. As a market person, where I've seen in the past other markets develop, commodity markets, bond markets, derivative markets, etc., even in the technology space, often it is a trial and error, and it is working to a point where you get some sort of standardization, people coalesce around that. This is one where we sort of came to the table trying to set the rules, and that has some of its benefits. But when I've looked at the progress over the last 3 or 4 years, I've seen a lot of private sector, private capital type organizations trying to develop some of these markets, bringing capital into place. But then sometimes they're accused, well, that is not right, that's not perfect, there's not real abatement, etc. And that stops. And sometimes I do think that's a bit of a shame. You know, let that run for a period of time, see if it crowds in some investment, see if it allows for 3 or 4 projects to take place. Then, of course, the regulators might come in and say, well, that was great, but let's do it another way. So that's another debate that I think we should bring to the table, because I felt that there was some progress there a couple of years ago, and then that got pulled back.
And I mean, I guess one of the related to this is how much to rely on offsets or carbon renewal credits. I know, exactly. You know, that's part of the Bank of America's plan. So, do you think that the position is going to have to evolve on that when they're given the amount of scrutiny around that whole industry of offsets?
Exactly. I think it is a bit of a shame. I think it's an important mix, but it became a little bit of a dirty word, as it were. And so, you know, I'd say the debaters pull back a little bit from that. But I think it's
from offsets.
Offsets, yeah. and you know, just the authenticity around, you know, voluntary carbon credits, etc. But I think that it's a really important tool to fix certain parts of this incredibly complex mix. Sorry.
I would like to fully agree to that, because many European companies have committed to be carbon neutral earlier than the government targets. And since the technologies will not be there, you want to put the money somewhere else to offset it. So I think we really need to urgently develop a global framework which is not discredited, which is really high quality, that you can put your money, because the willingness to invest there is clearly there. And it is, you can save a lot of more carbon in other regions of the world with less money. And I think that would be a task which needs to be driven by G7 or others, because currently we get a lot of scrutiny also when we think we have very high quality projects from our investors, from NGOs, but we need a global standard on that. That would really mobilize a lot of private capital.
Yes, Anish.
So I just want to add here, in terms of what Bernie said, that there is actually a lot for us to celebrate. While there are multiple questions, if I look across the last 5 years, the level of commitment from the private sector has gone up by leaps and bounds. If you look at industries that have shown that they can be, from market mechanism standpoint, viable, we look at renewables, we look at electric vehicles, we built net zero carbon resorts in India, net zero carbon residential buildings. So we are starting to decarbonize industries. These are proven projects. This is not where subsidies are coming in now, except for electric vehicles, which will need it for some time till it crosses that threshold. So we've got a lot that we can do. It's about scale up. The entire message has changed from can we do it to how do we scale up. And to me, that's something we should celebrate, and we should look at taking that forward.
But we have to do it quickly. We have to celebrate and then keep moving. I think there's a question, yes.
Yes, thank you, first of all, for the very insightful debate already. I'm Marius from the Young Voices here, and in preparation for this event, we already had some discussions with the other students, and one hot topic was the negative externalities. And my question to the panel would be, what steps are taken and can be taken to make these negative externalities like emissions, carbon pricing, you for example said it already, more globally coordinated and transparent, and how could these steps already look like? Thank you.
Who wants to take that on?
No, I think we need we need more political and geopolitical debates. We need more common goals. We need more mutual understanding. We need also more respect for the other opinions, because very often at the international level we have our, I repeat again, our narrow vision. We think that the world should be as we think it should be, but we need to take into account the fact that there are different sensitivities, different opinions, and if we are able to understand better what are the arguments, what are the reasons on the other side of the table, then we can build compromises. And the history of the EU is based on compromises, and we need more international political compromises to address those questions and to have more coordination.
Can I?
Yeah.
The global coordination, I think, within the UNFCCC COP28 is one of the platforms in which we are discussing. But then you are talking about the participation, which is much more diverse now. It is not only public-driven policy discussion, but private sector with the G-Vans and all is going to be like jump in. The question is more on the question we just previously mentioned. Are we going to approach this issue more ideological, which is more extreme, or you are going to be more pragmatic, and then you are learning from what you are doing? I think this is going to be the two very important forces which is going to drive. It will correct each other, but don't make the pragmatic one then totally paralyzed only because you are ideological one, or the ideological becoming unrealistic so that you are not going to be implemented, become just the idealism rather than really something that can be done. I think that is going to be the most important on the COP28 or other COP discussion later on, as well as when we are discussing about the multilateral development bank reform. This is going to be something, because at the end of the day, I think what I can observe is always like two forces. One very ideological extreme and the other one more pragmatical and try to solve the problem today.
Spoken like an astute politician.
Yeah.
We have another question.
Thank you. My name is Tabi Leoka, and I'm an economist from South Africa. So as you know, South Africa is on the extreme end when it comes to this discussion. I actually feel like we've reached our target forcefully without, because of our electricity challenges. So, the question that's been asked around the table is, has the timeline been set? And I think it has. It started with banks not willing to fund, power stations. For instance, Eskom cannot find funding in South Africa. And it's become very challenging for Eskom, the only electricity generating entity in South Africa. It's become very difficult for it to raise capital as a result of that. So, the timeline has been set and the rules have been set. I think the banks closed their taps too quickly for some countries like ours. We talked about the cost of capital. The cost of capital, especially for some of our countries on the continent, has become very punitive. And so when we think about renewable, when we think about transitioning, and I think it was mentioned earlier, I think it was the finance minister, we need to think about the just transition. It has huge ramifications for people. Small businesses have closed down. It has implications on education, as students cannot study because they don't have electricity. We're not linked to the grid, so some of our companies that can generate electricity generate for themselves and they're not linked to the grid. So it's creating all sorts of inequality. And on top of that, we're watching Germany restart their power stations and also import coal from South Africa, and also mining companies, especially coal mining companies, making a lot of money out of all of this. So as we talk about a just transition. I'd like to put it out there and to say, are we thinking about the just from a humanity perspective? And also we need to think about not just countries transitioning in unison, because we're not all equal, our challenges are different. How can we ensure that as we move forward, because we obviously have to transition, how do we ensure that we do it in the most just way, considering all challenges that countries are faced with? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think, this was one of the topics of the conversation, and we've mentioned it in passing almost, but so far we are failing on the just energy transition, Mr. President. Yeah. When you think of the example of South Africa, there's not enough incentive.
I think this is a very good example that I know a bit the energy situation in this country. But when I said we need an honest conversation, we need to put everything on the table. On the one hand, I repeat again, there is the need for the reforms at the international level to bring more fairness. And it's not a question of mendicity, it's not a question of charity, it's a question of common interest, and that's why we need this honest conversation, point one. But we need also to take into account the need for some of the developing countries to make sure that there is good governance, and that we make sure that the resources of the country are mobilized in order to address the common challenges, which is also a topic that needs to be addressed. And finally, on the EU side, I don't say we are perfect, certainly not, but I think that we do not have any hidden agenda. We have a clear vision about what, in our opinion, should be the values we need for the world, what should be the principles that we need for the world, what should be the multilateral world. But on our side, we are doing a lot. Do you know, for instance, that 43% of the development aid comes from the EU and its member states? Do you know, for instance, that the EU is the main sponsor for the multilateral agencies in the UN system? It means that we are playing our role. Do we know, for instance, that when we made the promise, the developed world, that we would dedicate 100 billion euros for the most vulnerable countries to address climate change, the EU fulfilled very quickly its commitment by mobilizing more than our share, if I compare to the GDP, 23 billion euros a year since 2021. It means that we are not perfect. I'm humble, I'm modest. We need to work together. We need to listen to each other, to learn together what are the lessons. But I think that the EU is doing what's needed, and we are ready to be a loyal, an active interlocutor to try to make the world a fairer place.
I think, sorry, it's such an important point. And we touched on it. Not every country is starting in the same place, and absolutely a country that is not developed yet, burning fossil fuels, versus countries that have fully developed with fossil fuels, and then setting the agenda is something that should be addressed, and I think that's part of what it is today. That's why we need different mechanisms. Absolutely, there's the private banks, there's the multinational banks. It's interesting that the World Bank, I believe, with the new leadership, yes, is the idea behind that, I think, was driving a new agenda around how does the World Bank make sure that the transition is more just. Indonesia has 36% or whatever, debt to GDP, so there's more fiscal room there. I think the EU is looking to appoint a new head of the EIB. The EU should look at the EIB, which is a large multilateral bank, and figure out what the agenda should be for the next period of time. It did very well up until this point, and it needs to figure that out.
Do you try to answer, if you talk about the just in a normative way, you are not going to get the answer, maybe because then you can always define what does it mean to be just. But if you are trying to put it within the context of what does it mean for Eskom in South Africa, suddenly you don't get any source of financing, or even if you are going to get, it's going to be extremely expensive. Then you have to deal with this transition of energy, the existing coal vis-a-vis the new renewable, who's going to bear the cost of capital, because many renewable is front-loaded. It's going to be very expensive. What does it mean in terms of electricity cost for the people? Are you going to shut down all the coal suddenly? These are all the real case of this just. And then the question is, the measurement that you would like to address is, you're not only talking about just in a normative way, but the implication on a social, environmental, and governance point of view. I think this need to be discussed within this
And
just.
I guess one part of the fairness is to have equally profitable programs in the north and the south, investors to be able to look at those in a similar way by having interventions to reduce, for example, the hedging. You know, in the Bridgetown Agenda, one of the focuses has been instruments that the MDVs could create to reduce the cost of hedging. Do you think, Bernie, just as a sort of technical matter, do you think that could make a big difference to the financing for places like South Africa?
Perhaps I wouldn't have that at the top of the agenda. I think that an MDB like the World Bank or the EIB changing its or leaning into a more aggressive stance in terms of what it needs to finance and being more declarative on that transition. It's interesting, in the US, we talked about that earlier, there has been pushback against banks not financing fossil fuels. So Bank of America, we're not alone. It's public knowledge. We've been subpoenaed by a bunch of states asking us, are we making sure that we're applying our balance sheet to some of those technologies? And then there are other NGOs and others that are making sure that we finance the other side as well. So within that ecosystem of a wealthy economy, they were able to make sure that that transition was addressed. I think the point that was made is that in South Africa, if the World Bank turns off the taps, if the private sector turns off the taps, and you have a situation where they don't have enough energy, they've got the energy resources that they're digging up and selling to parts of the EU where they need it, for their energy needs. And I think that's the core of what we're discussing today. How do we thread that needle?
Okay. I think one more question.
My name is Talat Mahmood. I am a German citizen of Pakistani origin. So my question is diverted for this country, Pakistan, which is at the moment facing severe public and debt financial crisis. And on the other side, because of high interest rates, private capital is also very expensive. So my question is, what kind of new innovative financial instruments, including blended and structured financing and risk sharing, are needed, where public finances resources can partly reduce and mitigate risks for investments?
Who wants to take that on?
The Pakistan situation in this case, in which the existing situation on the fiscal side is actually have difficulties. So when you are trying to get the new financings, the sources may be from the MDB or some of the bilateral. But then the question on the private sector is going to be very difficult when the foundation or necessary condition is not there. That is stability as well as the macroeconomic sustainability. When asking about the blended finance, as the Indonesia experience in this case, it's going to be required to have a platform in which you are going to be able to combine a different source of financing. The philanthropy, including Bloomberg, Rockefeller and all, you put money, but you have a certain governance and purpose in this case. Private sector like GVANs, they have governance on the financing, whether Bank of America, Citi and others. And then you have bilateral, maybe they can have the debt conversion for the country in this case, and MDB which can be done. Then your own space, public finance in this case, because Pakistan is in a difficult, maybe you don't have enough fiscal space to do that. So you really rely on other with many different blended that require a different risk profile, appetite, and governance that need to be able to be managed. So I will suggest for the Pakistan to have a platform, just like what we have, the Energy Transition Mechanism country platform. That is the place for us to discuss about all those differences of all these sorts of financing.
And some of it can be regional. I believe, I'm not an expert, that Pakistan has a lot of historical relationships in the Middle East with some of the largest Middle Eastern countries, and there has been some aid there, but that's where, a little bit to your point, set up a platform to be able to crowd in some of that as well, some of the Middle Eastern countries.
Okay, we're pretty much out of time. I want to give all of you a very brief word to galvanize the rest of the day, but also to help set the agenda as this discussion has. If you think about the year ahead, and how much was achieved at Bretton Woods in a few weeks, let alone a year, but what is the one thing or the most important priority for the international community, whether it's at COP28 or in other fora, to support this agenda? Mr. President?
No, for me, goal number one is to make sure that we are going in direction of a multipolar world. This is goal number one, to make sure that we have a rules-based international order with mutual respect. And when you said maybe it will take time to reform the multilateral banks, I don't know, because sometimes we can observe that there are accelerations. And I have the impression that today there is more and more understanding across the world that the institutions from the past cannot work today with the same outcomes and the same efficiency, because the world has dramatically changed. And if we do not change, then collectively we'll pay the bill. And that's why it is so important to be determined. And again, I think that we in the EU we have a role to play, and the G7 has a role to play. And sooner or later there will be a serious debate on the enlargement of the G7. I have no doubt on that topic, which is showing that we need much more inclusivity if we want more justice, more fairness in the future.
Bernie, what can happen in the next year that could put us on to change the trajectory, put us on a better path?
Well, perhaps COP28, insofar as we're talking about the climate piece of it, I think that, which has been held in the Middle East and the UAE, I think that if we can get these conversations to help to figure out what that transition trajectory should be, whether it's you Minister, you put it well in terms of the sort of the perfect of the ideological piece or the pragmatic piece. If we can calibrate that, I think it'll allow the rest of us a little bit more visibility as to what the investment thesis should be.
Markus Krebber.
The problem can only be addressed globally. So I think it's a question of what is the global path and what is the contribution of the different countries at which point in time, because they have different resources. So what we need in order to coordinate that is more dialogue, global dialogue, not only in Berlin.
More talking. Annabelle.
Global dialogue is not only happening among the head of states and all the government officials, it's a grassroots movement. We have to really include average consumer at individual level to really increase sense of awareness for this urgent matter.
Anish.
I would end with reiterating my ray of optimism. I think we've done a lot. I think we should look at every industry and look at how do we make that self-sufficient in terms of its transition, because once we do that, scaling up becomes much easier.
Minister, you have the last word.
Well, I think if we can provide, you talk about next year, if an example which is credible enough and sound enough on how this idea of just transition, I think that we are going to make a very good progress. And that's why the discussion on dialogue like this is very important. As mentioned by other, high interest rate and more extreme position is not going to help. So in a transaction case base, you are going to be able to test how much you are willing to take a risk, how much you are going to stretch the needle. I think that is going to be very important. Then you are going to continue doing all this necessary optimism that I share. Dialogue, multipolarity, need a lot of optimism to continue sharing and collaborating.
Optimism and dialogue, but also detail, I hear from you. Okay, thank you very much to all our speakers. I think...
Thanks, Stephanie. You survived, just about.
There's a 10-minute break, and then we have another panel here with the president of Sri Lanka and 2 parallel sessions somewhere else. 10 minutes.